obviously, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to the court that people categorically disagree with defense counsel's categorization of what went down in this case. This is a defendant who is extremely deserving of the sentence of life without parole. I know from past history in our office, perhaps had there been a different administration, I remember a case regarding the Green Widow who did something similar to this, and she received the death penalty. This is one of the most premeditated, calculated, devious murder conspiracies I've prosecuted during my 31 years at the district attorney's office. And as this court knows, I have handled numerous cases involving serial killers. This is a defendant who, but for her actions and her decisions, her husband, Fabio Sementilli, who gets lost in all of this circus that goes on every time we have one of these cases, he would still be alive today. This was a completely senseless murder driven solely by this defendant's greed and her lust, which we saw on full display during the trial that took place over the course of several months this year, based on her desire to get rid of her husband because he no longer served her purposes, and she needed to have a way to fund her life together with Robert Baker, who she chose over her husband, and whether her kids want to believe it or not, over her children, because they never ever even came up in any of the conversations that she had with so many people who testified in this matter. It's incredibly despicable as far as motives go, because again, without her and her plotting and her planning the murder of her husband, he would be alive today. But then you add to it the lengths this defendant went to in order to conceal and destroy evidence, and how time and time again she got others to do her dirty work for her, including her lover, so that he could get the murder done and she could take a step back and pretend to still be this loving wife, which we all know was a complete act. And once and again, it showed through the admissions that she was caught making in the jail lockup, through the letters about getting rid of her husband and wanting to marry Robert Baker, through the entire complex setup of this time frame for that day, shows a level of sophistication and planning that I rarely see in these kinds of questions, these kinds of cases. There is no question but that this defendant was the mastermind behind the murder of Fabio Sementilli. One only had to listen to Robert Baker's testimony for about 10 minutes before you got the clear picture of who was the mastermind between the two. Mr. Baker isn't smart enough to even follow up his lies with consistency. There was nothing that was credible about his testimony, and the jury so found. In addition to that, we had the testimony from Christopher Austin, and while he was kept out of the center of the conspiracy between the defendant and her lover, Robert Baker, he knew enough that this was being done at her behest. And as I've said from the beginning of the trial, this case was about the ultimate betrayal. This was one that I'm sure Fabio Sementilli never could have imagined in his wildest nightmares was coming, that his wife was literally plotting his murder with her lover. It's an absolute betrayal, not only of Fabio Sementilli, the victim in this case, but of her children, who have been brainwashed by her lies and her deception. And that's their choice. They're adults now. If they choose not to face the truth, that's on them. But we're here to do a job. We've done our job. The jury did their job. And we're here to hold the defendant, the main player, the heavy in this case, responsible for her actions. She used her family, her children, her parents, her sister, to do her dirty work for her, to lie to their father in order to cover up this scandalous affair that she had been having for at least a year, and God knows what else she used them for. She manipulated everybody, all of her friends, all of her family, anybody who came into contact with her for the most minor of things, such as buying a vehicle. We heard about that. Fabio's co-workers, his colleagues from a multi-billion-dollar company fell all over themselves trying to help her and the family after the murder, and yet they were treated with such disgust and disdain on the stand, as if those people somehow had done something wrong because they were reaching out to help the defendant, who they thought was this innocent widow who had lost her husband by some horrific tragedy, not of her own making. What we have in this case, just to be clear, although I think it was very clear through the trial, was the fact that this defendant and Robert Baker are a perfect match. You have two sociopaths who are completely incapable of any feeling of remorse or guilt. From the beginning until the end, and even now, the defendant is sewing a news story about how she somehow was taken advantage of by Robert Baker. And the stories, the defenses just continue to change as she sits in the jail. I think she's probably even convinced herself of that at this point, which is completely typical of sociopathic behavior. They only feel sorry for themselves, believing they're the true victims here. It was proven over and over and over again by their appalling recorded conversations in custody. And then you have the outrageous manner that this defendant and her lover chose in order to execute Fabio Sementilli, to murder him in his own backyard, to stab him to death in such an egregious and evil manner as he was relaxing and working out at the pool, thinking that he had his whole life in front of him as his 50th birthday was quickly approaching, having bought himself finally at the age of 49 and a half a used Porsche because he felt like he had earned the right to do that. And yet his entire life, his entire future was savagely taken from him for absolutely no reason, stabbed to death in his own backyard. And again, we're talking in this case about a victim who was totally innocent, totally vulnerable. As much as she now tries to dirty him up and convince her daughters, oh, he was a dirtbag and he was having an affair, none of that had any evidence to support it. It's just, once again, a way to try to make herself look better, which is, again, typical of sociopathic behavior. To prey on an unsuspecting, completely unarmed, vulnerable, innocent victim who was viciously slaughtered as if his life had no meaning, when she could have just elected to divorce him. And we've seen this before time and time again, as if his life had no value. And she and her lover showed Fabio Sementilli no mercy. She's not deserving of any mercy of this court. She hasn't admitted to anything that she's done. She hasn't taken any responsibility for her actions in this case. She's just made one excuse after another, after another, after another, as she will continue to prey on people until the day she dies. I can only hope, as his family does, that Fabio at some point lost consciousness fairly quickly with the loss of blood before he bled out. And I'm sure that at no point in time as he lay there dying, unless he was told by Robert Baker why his life had to end this way. And then to learn that she had planned this murder with Baker to have Fabio slayed initially in a public parking lot, as the court recalls, the night before he was murdered on January 22nd, a Sunday night, when she sent him out to pick up dinner. The sheer arrogance of this defendant is incredibly stunning and shocking, caring not at all for how this would destroy her daughter's lives. and the cloud that they will forever live under now going forward based on the Sementilli name and what that means. And I know that the law says a jury can't make a decision based on emotion. And so they didn't really get to learn much about who Fabio Sementilli was. But I did over the course of almost 9 years as I handled this case. I must have spoken to over 200 people in the course of my investigation and preparation of this case. And I couldn't find anybody, although I asked, because I was sure there had to be a skeleton somewhere. I couldn't find anyone who didn't ardently believe that Fabio Sementilli was one of the most genuine, wonderful people they had ever met or ever worked with or ever worked for. Not one person had one bad word ever to say about him. He was beloved, maybe not by his wife, but by everybody else, including his ex-wife. And that says a lot. He was a thoroughly decent human being who wanted the best for everybody he came in contact with. And that's a very unique, rare individual in this extremely difficult world that we live in today. The most important thing to him, according to everybody I spoke to, was his family. And that's why this murder was such a betrayal by his wife. This is also, as I've said, a defendant who perpetuated numerous lies for almost a decade. She's a habitual liar. We presented a ton of evidence regarding that. She has zero remorse. She's taken no responsibility for the murder of her devoted husband, who was devoted to her for over 20 years, even before they were married. And she clearly has earned the right to spend the rest of her life in prison. There was such overwhelming evidence in this case as to guilt, as well as to the special circumstances regarding the murder for financial gain, such as it was at some point the court prohibited us from putting on any more witnesses because there was so much evidence regarding the life insurance, as well as all of the other policies and retirement accounts and monies that Fabio had accumulated over and through his own hard work over decades, bringing himself up from nothing to a hairdresser, to a celebrity hairdresser, to a platform artist, to a vice president of a multi-billion-dollar company, as well as the special circumstance in this case of lying in wait, which we heard in excruciating detail from the defendant's lover, Robert Baker. So at this point, I think that the people and the family, as well as all of his close friends and some of his coworkers, are very anxious for this court to bring justice to this case at long last.
Your Honor, could I respond briefly?
Normally I do not allow that, but I'll allow a brief statement by you.
Your Honor, I didn't know this was going to be a repeat of our closing argument. I just want to say that the prosecution, Ms. Silverman, has every right to comment on the conduct and the jury verdict regarding the defendant. I do not believe she has the right to demean her family, her daughters, her sister, all of whom know Monica Sementilli far better than the prosecutor, and who continue to believe in her innocence, her background, who she was before this terrible incident, and who she remains. She will be paying for the rest of her life whatever the court decides. But the idea that her family, who testified on her behalf, somehow makes them less individuals who care about their father or their mother-in-law or care less about what occurred here is simply wrong. They love their daughter, and they love their sister, and they love their mother. And that is their right. And they testified under oath here what they felt and believed and still believe. I do not think it's proper for the court to consider it. I don't think the court will. But for the prosecution to attempt to demean their character and their love for their their mother and their sister as Ms. Silverman has just done, and I object to it.
All right, thank you. Ms. Simmons, anything further?
Yeah, I did no such thing.
Different type statements, please.
There are.